Okay, this is my week 3 visual reflection. So just to kind of start out, I thought just by the readings, what really stuck out to me was that even during being oppressed, there was always somebody that wanted to stand up for their culture and their beliefs and their people, and that just went from Booker T. Washington and Ida B. Wells and W. E. Du Bois. Reading about them is just I think it's more inspiring just to see that even in times where it looks like there's no out, there was always somebody like them to kind of pick up the motive and change the narrative during that time. I think what really stuck out to me was Du Bois, and just how he kind of had that whole you can't postpone fighting for justice mentality, and just you have to know what you're worth and stuff like that. And just his whole mentality was just basically you can't compromise something to be great and have that weight. So just waiting on something like that and waiting on being able to knowing your worth, you can't compromise that. So I think that was the biggest thing I got from the readings. Just going off the video. So firstly, just a slave. Actually, where should I start from? Just a lot. I'm just gonna read off a bunch of different points actually. So during the time period, there was big happenings back then, and slaves basically could kill their slave owners legally with the Emancipation Proclamation, which allowed blacks to fight and defend themselves when they were allowed into a war. So that was a big turning point, because now it kind of gave means for us to be able to defend ourselves. That was through the Emancipation Proclamation. So we finally had to. But on the other hand of that happening, during being able to fight, we weren't always actually allowed in the military, which was, we kind of had to fight for the right to fight, which I think that really stuck out with me, because back then whites didn't think we were competent enough or strong enough or smart enough to be able to fight in the wars back then. So that really stuck out to me. But even with the Civil War being over and the Emancipation Proclamation saying that we were all free, basically, the Civil War through World War II, we weren't slaves, but we weren't free or equal, if that makes sense. The white Southerners back then had pushed blacks all the way to the closest thing that was slavery back then. And basically the South during the war, they would capture African Americans and they would force them to work for years on end without pay or anything like that. So it was just it was kind of they're the closest thing they can get to slavery. I forgot who said it. It didn't have a name. There was this lady in the video that said African Americans were innately wired to know their own, to know what the whites had done. And it was kind of being an adopted child, where you're kind of forced to know about something else, as opposed to a lot of African Americans didn't really know, herself didn't really know what was really special about her upbringing and who paved the way for her. So that was also really important, I thought, just because I feel especially back then, African Americans weren't really our history and stuff like that wasn't really shine light upon. So just I think the biggest thing with that is just knowing where we came from and what we had to endure, and then also what we had to survive, basically. Another good point. But this did kind of make we did make a couple positive steps in the direction of being free, and eventually, as time went on, convictions of whites that had enslaved us were starting to happen, and that basically was marked the end of actual slavery. That was the tail end of slavery. There was a Texas case where a man had owned an African American for 15 plus years, and he got 40 years in jail. So that was the marking point for the end of slavery. But 80 years after the Civil War, 800,000 African Americans, 800,000 plus African Americans were forced to corrupt Southern justice system. And those arrested after the Civil War were forced into involuntary service. So that just leads back into what I was saying earlier, that there wasn't slavery, but it was about, they got to the closest thing they could to slavery without, kind of pressing any buttons back then with the corrupt justice system. After this, though, with all that being said, there was a Black Renaissance and revival, and point where we were considered equal. Like on paper, we were considered equal. So we were separate but equal. Blacks started to leave the South in the Great Migration, which was like the biggest movement in American history of people in the United States. But there were laws in the South back then, which is why we tried to migrate, like the Jim Crow laws, which was kind of like just to keep the African Americans in place. And Jim Crow, which is what they called the laws, were like, they just controlled black lives in the South with legal laws that replicated aspects of enslavement. So they're basically, it's about the closest, like I said, it's about the closest thing to being enslaved. Also, blacks fighting, okay, so now we move forward kind of like World War II-ish. Blacks fighting in the war threatened the whites, and an outbreak of violence started in Charleston and spread through the cities. So this kind of was just showing, like, even though we kind of took a couple steps forward, there was always something in the way, which kind of forced us to take a step back. So during this outbreak of fighting and basically like racism of blacks, it was known as Red Summer, and it was just a bunch of, basically all throughout the United States, was just a bunch of whites that were beating African Americans wrongfully and just kind of going on a rampage just because they felt threatened by the fact that we were finally free. And the biggest quote I got from this whole thing was a man on the last video, and he said, "We left the cotton fields, but it looks like a dead end. No progress is being made." So it just kind of shows that even after all that, like, and the whole separate but equal, like, we didn't really feel equal, and it like constantly had to remind us of like, and we had to like reevaluate what we actually meant to this country and like what our ties were to this country. And obviously there was a lot of like public figures, African American wise, that, you know, still tried to uplift. And I think that's the biggest thing with what I read this whole time, is like our ability to be able to bounce back from stuff that was wrongfully done to us throughout history.